Our speakers are here, so I think we can start. Apologies for delay. So it's my greatest pleasure to chair this final session of this amazing conference. It's really great to be here and to witness the cutting-edge research in the history of Armenian genocide and late Ottoman history as well, and learn so many new things. Being a medievalist myself, I don't research a lot, so I listen to people who know more about this, and it's really exciting to be here. And I hope you are also enjoying yourselves and learning quite a few new things. And soon I will acquire this new habit of writing my own diary, so at one point. Let me start by introducing our first speaker. Our first speaker today is Ken Schull. Ken Schull is Associate Professor of Ottoman and Modern Middle Eastern History and Director of the Center for Middle East and North African Studies, as well as the Director of the Ottoman Demographic, Social and Family History Research Group at Binghamton University, State University of New York. He was also the Dumanian Visiting Professor in Armenian Studies at the University of Chicago last term, spring 2025. He's a fellow alumnus of Oxford University and UCLA as well. He's been a Fulbright Scholar to Turkey, and one of his publications is A Missionary to the Middle East, the Journal of Joseph Wilfred Booth, which he co-authored with James Toronto, published in 2024. Another of his publications is Prisons in the Late Ottoman Empire, Microcosms of Modernity, 2014. So he's published extensively on the topic, and his research interests include the social and cultural history of the Ottoman Empire and modern Middle East, criminal justice, missiology, Armenians in the Ottoman and post-Ottoman Middle East, forced migrations, and Ottoman demographic and family history. And today he's going to speak, the title of his talk is Reassessing the Role of Ottoman Prison Convicts in the Armenian Genocide, Triangulating CUP Memoirs and Trial Proceedings with Ottoman Prison Statistics. So let's welcome our speaker.
I don't have a PowerPoint for you. I'm following in Janice's example of going old school from last night. But I want to first thank profusely Barlow and Ahmed for their invitations here, for the opportunity to come and participate in this international conference, a new history writing of the late Ottoman-Turkish history, the impact of memoirs. I want to thank the Armenian Studies program here at Fresno State University and all of its generous supporters. I also want to thank my co-panelists and presenters and those who are kind enough to give their time to moderate and to keep us on time. This talk is a long time in coming. While preparing my first book on prisons in the late Ottoman Empire, published in 2014, I was asked repeatedly about the role prisoners played in the Armenian genocide. I was very curious and open to this narrative, and read quite extensively on it, and I was interested to see if I could uncover any evidence of this in the recently opened files of the Ottoman Prison Administration, where I started my dissertation research way back in 2003. This talk is an attempt to bring various sources together in order to investigate the claim that convicts played a major role in the Armenian genocide. As we know, by our distinguished guest, by Professor Akçan, also Vakan Dadrian, they assert that convicts were one of the three main participants in the Jetes, the killing squads, who perpetrated the Armenian genocide during World War I. And the other two were Kurdish irregular soldiers and Muslim refugees from the Caucasus, from the Balkans, in that region. Their evidence is based primarily on the primarily on the 1919 trial transcripts, Ottoman official public statements, and secret cables of the Ottoman Interior Ministry. Their central argument claims that thousands of prisoners were released and prisons were emptied across Anatolia, especially in Trabzon and Erzurum during this time period for the convicts to join the Çetes, the killing squads. These assertions have led, in some cases, to quite exaggerated claims by other scholars that as many as 30,000 prisoners were released, that the prisons were emptied across the empire. This is obviously not their fault. I'm not blaming them for it. But this has led to a lot of exaggerations that have gone into popular culture, but also in assertions that come into scholarly works. So, as I said, these assertions link to this. While being useful sources, there are serious doubts regarding the veracity of trial interviews and the limits of memoirs. As Janet Klein last night, as Duygu, as Yeat, and obviously as Umid have talked about today and yesterday, memoirs are useful sources, but they're just one data set, one data point that has their limitations. Basically, that memoirs are problematic sources since being written sometimes many years after the fact, memoirs can be vague on details and get specific dates, names, and places wrong. Sorry, I'm going to put this up here so I can see it better. My eyes are not what they used to be. They can also be subject, obviously, to delusions of grandeur or ideological agendas, especially if somebody's trying to exonerate or justify their actions. And we've seen this in many of the presentations today, also in Professor Akçam's keynote address last night. So they can. So this presentation aims to triangulate the memoirs of several key CUP officials, namely Talat Pasha, Jamal Pasha, and journalists such as Mevlanzadeh, Rifat, and Ziya Shakir, with Ottoman prison records and statistics during the war in order to provide a clearer picture of the role that convicts played in the special organizations, the Teşkilat Mahsus's killing squads, and how many participated. I'll first briefly discuss the main sources utilized by scholars to substantiate the claims that Ottoman convicts made up one of the most important groups to carry out the Armenian genocide. Then I discuss the importance of prison statistics and documents from the Ottoman Prison Directorate, and how a triangulation of these official sources with memoirs and other official and unofficial documents, such as trial records, newspaper articles, diaries, help us get at who the perpetrators of the genocide were, at least a little closer to it. So, a core narrative, as I mentioned, concerning the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide. Sorry, I wanted to start my timer here, but I forgot. The core narrative of the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide during World War I claims that Ottoman convicts were released from prisons to join the killing squads. The official narrative regarding the participants in the killing squads is laid out clearly in Professor Akçam's several of his books, from Empire to Republic. He asserts the formation of the special organization in the region Erzurum stated in the second half of August 1914, started in the second half of August of 1914. Three important sources were used for recruitment: Kurdish tribes, convicted prisoners, and immigrants from Caucasia and the Balkans. He goes on to talk about the release of prisoners and how important that was, and says to benefit, it is necessary, and quoting the secretaries of the CUP who came, I'm still quoting Professor Akçam, to the region, wrote in the report, quote, "It is necessary to benefit from the prisoners in Trabzon prison, to release them from prison to form gangs with them under the command of officers and assign the more notorious ones gang leadership." Also says later, also quoting the decision, this was taken at the beginning of September by the headquarters of the special organization in Erzurum, the center in Erzurum, through the intervention with official departments, secured the release of prisoners. Then the prisoners and the Kurdish leaders were recruited as gang members, or the Çete members. The release of prisoners that started in eastern Anatolia was later to be conducted throughout the whole country. It created a problem with the government that prisons were emptied without any such legislation having been issued, and the minister in question were informed of the practices only after the fact. So much of this comes from the main trial, the succession of the main trial documents, quoting from the Bursa CUP area. Professor Akçam continues in the shameful act to talk about how Ahmed Rafiq, for example, claims that, quote, these gangs were composed of murderers and thieves who had been released from incarceration. They received a week's worth of instruction in the courtyard of the War Ministry and were then sent to the Caucasus border through the agency of a special organization. During the Armenian atrocities, it was these gangs who perpetrated the greatest crimes. It goes on that by November 1914, the work of emptying the prisons had progressed. In Trabzon, for instance, a unit of some 700 to 800 had been formed of prisoners. The Austrian Council in Trabzon also confirms that the irregular units formed in Riza contained convicts and under the leadership of German officers. According to his report, according to the Austrian diplomat's reports, a 169-man unit created from convicts in Trabzon had been sent to the Caucasus. This group was followed by a 1,000-man strong Hamidiya unit made up of Kurds. Bless you. For the total number of gangs and members, different estimates exist. Philip Stoddard, who held a series of discussions with Kushchubasha Eshref, put the number of people involved in the Chetes at about 30,000. So from this, Professor Akçam has substantiated his assertions based upon 4 main sources. And if I've missed something, please tell me. There's the Umumi Harpte Teshkilat Masusa. This is a newspaper article or newspaper series published in 1933 about the various trials. These were reiterated, the trial testimonies during the 1919 trials held against the CUP by the Entente occupation forces. The second is the contents of the 5th Department that was founded on the suggestion of the late Deputy Fuat Bey in order to bring the cabinets of Said Halim and Mehmed Talat Pashas to justice. This was published as a protocol of parliament by the Istanbul Publishing House in 1990, they date back to 1919. Then there's the third main source, is the 1918 parliamentary hearings presided over by Ahmed Riza. And the fourth main source are some memoirs from former CUP members and journalists from the time. And then the fifth is the secret coded telegrams from the Ministry of the Interior to the Special Organization in 1914 and during World War I. Did I miss anybody?
No corrections.
Okay, please, yeah, no, I'm open to all the corrections, no, not a problem. So major memoirs and diaries, though, that I want to talk about, such as Talat Pasha's Black Book, his Analar, that describes all of these in detail, the deportations, the numbers of deaths, what happened to him. And Cevdet Pasha's diaries never mention freed convicts as perpetrators. They do mention Kurds, and they do mention Circassian and Balkan refugees, but they don't ever mention convicts there. Talat is important to focus on here because here is possibly the single most important source as the chief architect of the genocide, including their deportation, their resettlement, property confiscations, and mass murder. Interestingly enough, he was also, and this is what I found and published in my book, was also the architect of the Ottoman prison reform program when he was Minister of the Interior in 1911, and then saw it revived after the triumvirate came back into power, so to speak, after the 1912 elections and the coup in 1913. So if prisoners were main perpetrators of the genocide, then Talat Pasha's silence is very odd, and I'm wondering why. He mentions the others. Whereas journalists such as Mevlanzadeh Rifat and Zia Shakir, who were critical of the CUP as former members, do discuss prisoner convicts as sources of the killing squads, but they quote the trial transcripts themselves of Halil Menteshi's interview, Ahmed Riza's interview themselves. Therefore, they don't provide any new evidence, nor do they triangulate their arguments with others. Therefore, the silence by the major architects of the genocide and the reliance on the trial transcripts by journalists of the time raise some doubts about the veracity of the claims that prisoners made up the core forces of the special organization or the killing squads. Reliance on the trial transcripts and journalists' accounts have facilitated some gross exaggerations by others regarding the role of prisoners played in the Armenian genocide by the general public and even academics. For instance, Ruben Paul Adalian of the Armenian National Institute writes on their website about the Armenian genocide, saying, quote, "As its instrument of extermination, the government had authorized the formation of gangs of butchers, mostly convicts released from prison expressly enlisted in the units of the so-called special organization. This secret outfit was headed by the most ferocious partisans of the CUP, who took it upon themselves to carry out the orders of the central government with the covert instructions of their party leaders," close quote. So they were the majority, according to popular memory. Christian Coates Ulrichsen's The First World War in the Middle East, which came out in 2014 on the centenary of the beginning of World War I, makes one of the most outlandish claims, and I think he takes your quotes completely out of context. He says on page 61, he states that by the end of April 1915, more than 30,000 prisoners were released from the Ottoman jails to form the nucleus of the Çetes, or killer bands, although they were augmented by military and provincial police in a systematic organization of mass murder. Both writers cite Professor Akçam's From Empire to Republic on page 162, which I quoted above before, as the source of their claims. It's very possible that certain prisoners were released to join the killing squads and participated willingly in these atrocities. However, the gross exaggerations are not corroborated by daily prison records and statistics so copiously collected by the Directorate of Prisons during World War I. And I'm sorry, I'm going to toot my own horn here. I've meticulously reconstructed these prison statistics during the Second Constitutional Period in Chapter 3 of my book, Prisons in the Late Ottoman Empire. And so what do these statistics tell us? And how do they help us understand a little bit more about the major perpetrators, or at least one of the main claimed groups of perpetrators of the genocide? I argue that Ottoman prison demographics demonstrate the following data to help us understand more clearly prisoners' role in the genocides of World War I. So in 1914 and 15, there were less than 30,000 total prisoners in the Ottoman prison system. You couldn't get 30,000 prisoners to join, what Ulrichsen has completely taken out of context. Trabzon and Erzurum's prisons were not emptied in 1914 and 1915. They listed 660 and almost 900 prisoners, respectively, there in those prisons during this time. Nearly half of the prisoners in the Ottoman prison system at the time were being held for trial, meaning they weren't convicts. They were awaiting trial. So of the 28,000 that actually were in there, almost 14,000 weren't convicted of anything. They were waiting for their trials, according to the detailed statistics they kept. Only those convicted prisoners, of those convicted prisoners, the roughly 16,000 who were convicts, convicted of crimes and sentenced to jail time, almost half of these prisoners were convicted of lesser offenses. They didn't pay their debts. They were petty thieves. These were people who got drunk and were caused a disturbance or something like that. They were in for between 3 weeks to 3 months incarcerated. Short amount of time. That's almost half. That's half of the 16,000, so 8,000, were these of lesser offenses. If we start, narrowing down and figuring out who these people could have been that were claimed to be part of the Çetes, it helps give us a better picture of this. Okay. Many convicted prisoners also, of those, as I said, many convicted prisoners at this time were non-Muslims. Not all of them, they weren't the majority, but there was a sizable, at least 10 to 15% in the prisons were non-Muslims. Either Greek Orthodox, primarily Armenian, or Jews. And they most likely would not have joined in the killing squads. Most likely. I'm making a grand, assumption here. And then finally, many prisoners were released to join the military, especially in 1916 and 1917, through an amnesty program started by Dr. Paul Pulitz, who was a German psychiatrist, a criminal psychiatrist who was hired by the Ottomans to come in and run their prison reform program and run the prisons in 1916. So during that time, many prisoners were released in 16 and 17 through the amnesty program. These were prisoners who were well behaved, who had served 2/3 of their sentences and had been convicted of lesser offenses. They were released to join the military, not the Chetes. Thank you. So these prison statistical records help us gain a clearer picture of the perpetrators of the genocide, and when coupled with memoirs, court statements, and other evidence demonstrate that while convicts may have played a role, it was much less than has been claimed. The triangulation of the sources provides greater veracity to claims of genocide and avoids falling into the prejudicial trap that all convicted criminals are murderers waiting to be unleashed to carry out horrendous acts of violence. This is a problem. My sociologist professor here in the room will understand this issue of criminal sociology and where this comes from. So the directive, I'm not here to say that this was all false, but we need to be able to triangulate sources to make sense of them between memoirs, official, unofficial documents. I'm not saying the prison statistics were perfect. They weren't. If there was one prison that could have been liquidated or opened to it, it would have been Sivas, because I don't have any prison statistics for them in 1914, 1915. Oh, well, they report one prisoner. So, whereas in 1916 and 17, they've got roughly 800 to 1,000 prisoners in there, the next year. So it's, what's happening here is important for us to be able to get beyond. Sometimes, memoirs are really useful for us to understand what people who are writing them believe at that time, what they remember and how they're processing it. Diaries, as has been discussed, can be very boring. I work with diaries and journals a lot in my new project, and they can give you this day to day without a perspective. So there's limitations on both. State documents have their own agendas, right? None of these is perfect, or trial transcripts or any of these, but when we can triangulate them, when you can bring them together to cross-reference, perhaps we get a clearer picture of that. And so in conclusion, very quickly, it's therefore imperative, and I just said that we as scholars triangulate, or as Professor Akçam suggested last night in his keynote address, integrate. I know you were talking geographically, but I would like to pull that and bring it in here to integrate various sources into our study of late Ottoman history to include official and non-official sources, such as memoirs, diaries, parliamentary proceedings, court and trial testimony, travelogues and narratives, and official statistical data. I think all of that can be very helpful for us to, in some ways, push back against the denialists. Don't give them more fodder. They will find whatever they want to. But to substantiate, understand really who did this, why, when this happened, so that ideally these types of things wouldn't happen again. Unfortunately, they are happening too often. So I don't want to throw out the proverbial baby with the bathwater and saying trial transcripts are no good, this is probably, but understanding all of these things together, because these data points help us understand perhaps a little clearer picture, particularly if we are skeptical, understanding their issues. I'm not saying anything new here. I'm just repeating what my wonderful co-panelists and co-presenters have already discussed. And so triangulating these sources enables us to check and cross-reference data and accounts to help us avoid gross exaggerations. No source is perfect. We must approach them all with skepticism. So my talk is a bit of a divergence from this conference and claims that we must also triangulate Ottoman official sources with memoirs, court trials, etc., to create an integrated history. Thank you very much.
Can I ask one question? If you dared,
If I dare.
to give us a number, like 2,500 to 5,000, would you say?
I have to.
If you dared?
If I dare, I have to dig into that more. I mean, I would talk much more among the low or the high hundreds to low thousands, as opposed to a huge group, because I'm just not seeing that here yet. If Sivas was completely emptied, then that would be maybe 800 right there.
Okay.
If that makes
Thank you. Thank you very much for sticking to time as well. That was perfect timing, especially thinking about this. This is a topic that is quite contemporary as well. You know that lots of prisoners now fight from Russia, fighting against Ukraine. They're just releasing them, murderers and the rapists, and everyone is just sent to the army. Our next speaker is Merisa Sahin. Merisa Sahin received her doctorate in political science from the University of Michigan in 2025, very recently, and her dissertation was Anti-Colonial Cosmopolitanism, Young Ottoman Anti-Colonial Thinkers and Projects of Global Integration from 1884 till 1914. Very recently, she has become a visiting professor, assistant professor in politics at the University of South Sweeney. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, I'm sorry. She studies comparative and global politics, political thought, with a special focus on Ottoman and Middle Eastern thinkers at the turn of the 20th century. Her writing has appeared in the Journal of the Ottoman-Turkish Studies Association and Comparative Studies of South Asian, African and the Middle East. And we have a very tiny change in the title, so her talk today will be entitled Ahmed Riza's Memoirs from a Radical to a Moderate. Let's welcome our speaker.
And apologies for the drastic change in my title. I'm not delivering on my promises. So hello, thank you so much for having me. This might be a bit of a tonal shift, though I'm glad Kent mentioned Ahmed Riza. Can you now hear me okay? I can. I'm sorry I said I sent one thing and wrote another. I've had a complicated past few months vis-a-vis, research and source access. And I sort of, as I was looking through Ahmed Riza's memoirs again for a second or third time, I'd only previously encountered them during my dissertation research, and I didn't think about them too much because the period I focus on with Ahmed Riza is actually his cooler period when he was in Paris and he was more of a radical. And I noticed as I was prepping for this conference that his memoirs barely mention that, and they really, really focus on when he comes back to Constantinople and after the 1908 revolution. That is 80% of what he writes in his autobiography. And I found that very interesting, and I thought maybe I can do something with that. So before I get to that part, just a brief info for those unfamiliar. Ahmed Riza is the original Unionist. He named the Committee of Union and Progress. He is from the earlier generation, so he lived between 1858 and 1930, and he was one of the founders. And he went on this he's very different to the second generation of Unionists, and you can sort of tell that from his political activity upon his return to the Ottoman Empire, and that as Dr. Schull mentioned, he gave a testimony that was very critical of the Armenian genocide later on, and he was critical of his own party later on. But he lived between 1858 and 1930. Between 1889 and 1908, he was in a semi-self-inflicted exile in Paris, and those are the years he was most active intellectually. And that's the part of his life that I wrote much more about. I had, of course, read his memoirs, but for my purposes while writing my dissertation, they weren't very useful to me because they only have a 15-page period of his 2 decades in Paris, and then the rest of it, which is about 90 pages, is about his 2 decades in Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, where he was much less intellectually active. And he really tones the radicalism down. So his time in Paris, there's a lot of novel ideas, a lot of talk of equality and critiques of capitalism and colonialism and critiques of Mehmed II and the regime in the Ottoman Empire. And then in his memoir, all of these kind of disappear. So hence the sort of title I just made up last night. Sorry. Thanks for bearing with me. So in my previous work, I cast Ahmed Riza as mainly an anti-colonial activist, and I was trying to think through connections between Ottoman thinkers and their, how they organized globally, how they organized within Europe with other thinkers from the non-West. You know, their connections with like Brazilian positivists and like, as well as like French intellectuals. So I was trying to like put that into like a, you know, their thought into a more global context, because they did write actually for an international audience in Meshveretz, which is like Ahmed Riza was the editor-in-chief of Meshveretz between starting from 1895. Part of like his exile, his escape to Paris, was initially an escape from Hamdian despotism. Like he thought he'd be free to do whatever in Paris. And it sort of ended up being a prison for him. Initially he was able to like write freely, but Abdülhamid did force the French government to shut down the Turkish edition of Meshveretz. So they had to publish exclusively in French starting from 1895. We get left with only the French supplement after that, and that's when it starts becoming more international actually. And Ahmed Riza and co end up seeing through this, and they sort of have an idea, like their illusions of the West as being like freedom of press and like you can say whatever you want ends up being, oh, this was a bit of a lie actually, because the moment Abdülhamid II was able to put a little pressure on the French government caved. You know, despite generally having the upper hand in international politics vis-a-vis the Ottoman Empire. And that is why I focus on my own work, my previous work, you know, the relationship between the domestic despotisms of the non-West, and particularly the Ottoman Empire, and their interaction with international despotism, which like at the time was like an ever-expanding colonial order, and currently a post-colonial / neo-colonial order, like depending on what thinker whose concept you want to use. Ahmed Riza spent 19 years in Paris, in particularly his earlier years, so like in the early 1890s. He was constantly in trouble with the Ottoman state and by extension the French state, as well as struggling to make ends meet. This actually comes up in his memoirs for like 2 sentences. He started to publish Meshveretz in 1895, which made like no money, and it made him a bigger political target, so just like bad for him personally generally. And this required him to get other jobs to make ends meet, and usually the jobs he would get would be translation jobs between like Turkish and French or Turkish and German, which meant he would have to deal with like at least Ottoman partnered companies. And immediately, whenever he got a new gig, somebody from the Hamidian government would like step in and he'd get fired. Which led him to find other allies and friends to help out with his political goals. Like he was hanging out with, Auguste Comte's students because he was a positivist for a time. He was friends with Georges Clemenceau. He had like a French circle as well as an Ottoman circle. And against many attacks by the Hamidian government towards the newspaper, the French state initially protected him, and the French intelligentsia supported him, and he was very appreciative of that. But ultimately, the French state did do what Abdülhamid II asked them to do, which was to shut down Meshveretz Turkish, like the original Meshveretz, I guess. This gave them a lot of insight about European foreign policy and like how much sway actually someone like Abdülhamid, like they thought of as like a super weak person at the face of European colonialism, could have over European foreign and domestic policy. In 1985 he writes, quote, "France has always set itself the task of defending the weak and the oppressed, spreading generous and liberal ideas, combating tyranny, practicing humanity, and seeking equality and religious independence. She cannot fail under these circumstances thanks to its glorious traditions and the very real pushback from the public opinion of its people, under which we are persecuted simply for asking the current Sultan to keep the promises he solemnly made. It is further proof shedding light on what a great and noble nation France is, to which all peoples of the universe have immense gratitude." End quote. This tone will shift in like 2 months, basically. Over time, he and others, particularly Hayiganem, like after he arrived, realized that France and other European countries, while espousing, Enlightenment ideals, freedom of speech, all of that, had really no principles in international relations, and what any country does, basically, is profit-seeking, and they're just like working with their national interests in mind. France was mainly guided by national interests, and those constantly shifted, their colonial policies constantly shifted, and this, this also became like a big theme later in Memoirs as the writers spent more time in Paris. They realized that France is not particularly against domestic despotism, for them, Hamidian despotism, especially when it's outside Europe. So like if someone like Abdelhamid or like a similar figure somehow had leverage over France and proposed a deal that was to the benefit of the French, they don't care that he's a despot, they just let him do whatever. They even cooperate. And I mean, I think like this is a clear thing to, in retrospect, anyone with like a post-colonial perspective, a left-wing perspective from the colonies. I don't think at the time this was a particularly mainstream take amongst young Turks, including Ahmed Riza himself generally. But this ended up in Memoirs producing much more critical work about both Abdülhamid II and Europe and their interaction and their, competing despotisms. After the ban in 1896, France banned circulation of Memoirs Turkish original within the borders of France. Their perception of France was shattered, and the idea of like a safe haven from Hamidian despotism was completely gone for young Turks. Apparently Hamidian despotism could sort of put its tentacles anywhere, and even more powerful states in the West caved to its demands. Its reach was much further. This sort of further radicalized them. Hamidian despotism started to get much more harsher criticism in Memoirs in the following years, and so did Europe, and so did capitalism, and so did colonialism. And it gets really interesting as you get to like 1900, because they expand their critiques to stuff like the Boxer Rebellion in China, and then how black people were treated in the United States. Like they just really start thinking about it globally. And I think in a lot of the work that looks at Memoirs, which there is a lot, they're usually framed as like domestic reformers, which they wanted too, but like they weren't just that. But like how they present Abdelhamid particularly is interesting, because initially he is presented as a puppet of the West. The Ottoman economy is largely controlled by the European powers. But later on they realize he has plenty of agency internally and externally, and could negotiate with European powers to kill off a newspaper that isn't even Ottoman based, and then come back and use the pressure he's facing from Europe to consolidate his power internally. So that is the interaction of the two despotisms. Basically they fed each other, and sometimes they harmed each other, but ultimately they created a double burden on the shoulders of non-Western populations. This became worse, obviously, if these parts of these populations that were minoritized. Maybe that's even a triple burden, one might say. Like the Hamidian massacres come up a lot in Memoirs, and most writers are extremely critical of them. Some of them are Turks, some of them are Arab, some of them are Armenian. And I wrote this sentence actually while I was preparing, and last night when Dr. Klein was presenting, I'm like, oh, maybe I'm assigning identities to these people that maybe they didn't really have. They ultimately thought of themselves as Ottoman, but I think there was this variety of native languages and perspectives in this newspaper. They're of course very critical of the Hamidian regime for inflicting such violence and pain to a minoritized population, but they were also critical towards Europe because they saw Europe as like seeing all of that happen and not intervening, despite being, the supposed protector of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. At this point, France stops being the defender of the oppressed, I guess. Much of Memoirs, I think, is actually about this particular pattern, like up until 1908, between domestic and international despotisms, which I think required a really, really critical eye and radical outlook politically. So you see all these sharp criticisms towards like a lot of entities, and it's just like really, really radical. At points, like it reads like Marx without all the jargon. And I found that fascinating because everything I read about these people were about domestic reform. And that is only half of the content, maybe. So the more interesting thing so little in Ahmed Riza's memoirs, despite being honestly, intellectually way more influential, more widely read while he was in Paris. As a political thinker, and like ultimately the reason I didn't pay too much attention to his memoirs is because I'm a political theorist and disciplinary stuff. But as a political thinker, this period between the 1890s up until 1908 is much more productive for him. But then the revolution happens, he comes back to Istanbul, he becomes a politician, and he becomes closer to power. And he seems to care much more about that in his memoirs. So the memoirs like 100 pages, the 2 decades in Paris are like maybe 20 pages, and then the rest, and that also includes like his childhood and his dad and like all of that. The remaining 80, 85 pages, which is like the same amount of time, is his political life after 1908, which wasn't as significant as one might think. But he seems to care much more about what he did upon his return than what he did prior to 1908. And I think that's really something I'd like to think about in the near future. The second thing is, and this is connected to the first thing, but I find it to be more important, his tone completely shifts about the Ottoman government and Abdülhamid II. About the dynasty at large, because obviously, like at some point, Abdülhamid just goes away and there's like other sultans. He was sort of like in contact with all of them. They were shoulder to shoulder in a lot of ways. But basically, so much of Mehmed was just incredibly harsh criticisms to Abdülhamid II. Later on, he becomes much less critical, and I think, I mean, it's obviously not because Abdülhamid II became this like democratic hero after 1908. What shifted was, apart from the revolution, was Ahmed Riza's own status and personal relationship with the Sultan. And like, first of all, he had a personal relationship with him. He didn't before. And he had a proximity to power that he never had when he was a revolutionary or an intellectual in Paris. And I think this is like, once you connect that to his intellectual writings, it's like really, I mean, there is a disconnect. It's actually quite difficult to connect. But you can see that from his memoir. It hadn't occurred to me previously because I was really locked into his Paris years, as anyone who studies him is actually. Also, that is most of his intellectual production. But I think Ahmed Riza as a politician is also interesting, worthy of study, if to see the shifts in his political life, but also the politics of the Ottoman Empire, as well as the Committee on Union and Progress. You see in his memoirs how his anti-Hamidian sentiments and politics go away eventually. He doesn't mention capitalism once, or colonialism too much, whereas so much of Mehmed is a critique of the, profit-seeking above all else Westerner and Ottoman empires. As his proximity to power increases, his radicalism goes away, which I guess is a classic pattern. But it is also funny considering how tumultuous his political tenure was between 1908 and his death in 1930. Upon his return, he becomes the president of the Chamber of Deputies, the Meclis-i Mebusan. He gets sidelined after the incident of March 31st. He makes a brief comeback as an envoy in 1914, who wanted to have the Ottoman Empire ally with Britain and France in World War I. We know how that worked out. In 1919, he went to Paris upon receiving the letter from Mustafa Kemal to lobby for a better peace treaty after Sèvres. He chronicles all of this in his memoirs, a lot of which, with the exception of the last one, was somewhat ineffective compared to the networks and the alliances he formed in his earlier, cooler, more radical years. So much of the memoir reads like, I was a guest with the Habsburg Empire. I was like having dinner with the King of Bulgaria. He wanted to give me a honor, and I said no. But like it's like he spent his days being an attaché without much influence. And the fact that he chose to highlight this part of his life where he was so close to power yet not really fully reaching it, I think is interesting and worthy of attention. As his proximity to power increased, his revolutionary politics sort of died out, with the exception of his atheism, I guess, which was troubling for him ultimately. But this ideological transformation from a radical anti-advertising, anti-capitalist, anti-colonial intellectual who writes for the world to a moderate politician who gets regular invites to royal dinners in the palace and now has a personal relationship with the monarch is maybe indicative of how, you know, political movements and their leaders could be co-opted into existing regimes that they were so critical of with like minor changes. His transformation, one could argue, could have been due to strategy. You know, ultimately he would have to, as the president of the Chamber of Deputies, briefly, he would have to work with Yıldız. And, you know, the monarchy wasn't abolished and whatever, so it's just like he had to be in those networks. But I don't think the reason was purely a matter of means. His politics after his return came with a growing contempt for mass politics, mass participation in politics. A contempt much larger than what he had in his earlier years in Paris. So like he starts to think about, I think, the Chamber of Deputies and is like, oh, like we enlightened men are doing things for the people aren't ready for stuff. So he sort of did a 180 and went back to thinking in more, enlightened terms, I guess, where you have this group of men, obviously, leading the country to its salvation in some ways, which is very different to his democratic ideals while in Paris, and like it really, really clashes with like how he thinks about colonialism, anti-colonialism prior to this. Why former revolutionaries become extreme moderates in their old age is a question a lot of people think about, I think, and whatever, you know. I don't want to make sweeping claims about it. But I do think in the case of Ahmed Riza, reading his memoirs gives us a much more complicated picture than how he is studied in our field, or in your field, as a committed revolutionary domestically and internationally. And that is also how I thought about him so far. But I do want to thank Ahmed and Barlow for organizing this conference that focuses on memoirs. So I got to think about how people represent themselves. And this was a point made by Dr. Akın and Dr. Taşat and everyone else, like in a much more articulate way than I have. But you know, with someone like Ahmed Riza, who has also like a lot of writing in the world, published, I'm almost done. Published, and like a lot of it is studies as such. His then, you know, representation of himself as primarily a politician with, that is like rubbing shoulders with all of these monarchs and having little influence, and really highlighting that as opposed to being a more radical person back in Paris, and, you know, hanging out with people who don't have much power but like have better ideas is, I think, quite interesting. I didn't pay much attention to it because political theorists don't look into history too much. That's the stereotype. That's not me, but that is a stereotype. But in thinking through how he presents himself in the memoirs as a sort of power broker that is close to the elite, close to the monarch, seems to be what he cared about a lot, ultimately. You know, if not having power, being close to power seems to matter to him. And I think that gives me and other people interested in his thinking a new perspective to think about his radical years, as well as think about what the Ottoman Empire was and what the Committee of Union Progress was at the time. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a dream panel to chair. Everyone is on time, so that's perfect. Let me introduce our last speaker for today. So Ekrem completed his studies in Istanbul and graduated with a degree in engineering from Istanbul Technical University. After receiving a master's degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and business administration training from Harvard University, he worked as a manager for an international technology company. Ekrem turned to academic studies after becoming interested in late Ottoman history. After receiving his graduate degree in history from Istanbul University, he enrolled in graduate studies at Istanbul Bilgi University, where he currently is. Ekrem Yener's academic research interest is the ethnic cleansing policies implemented by the Union and Progress administration in the last decade of the Ottoman Empire. In addition to researching Armenian traces in Ottoman archives, Ekrem maintains an extensive book collection and shares his finding at conferences and academic publications. So let's welcome our last speaker.
Being the last speaker in a conference, so I said, let me ask artificial intelligence, ChatGPT. I asked the question to ChatGPT, what is the advantage of being the last speaker in a conference? This is exact what words of the ChatGPT. It says, the audience size can sometimes drop near the end of the conference. Those who remain are often the most dedicated, engaged, and interested in the event's content. Your message is the last thing they will hear, and the first thing they will recall the next day. So we talked, for the 2 days, we talked about the diaries, memoirs, biographies, autobiographies. I've been reading diaries, memoirs, autobiographies for almost last 10, 20 years, for the period of 1908 till the 1927. The reason I end 1927, because I think that was the year, 1927 was the year in which the visible face of the Ittihadist or the Unionist was eradicated from Turkey. But the visible faces, actually, it remained. So, in terms of the diaries, memoirs, autobiographies, and biographies, actually, when you differentiate those things, and biography is like hiring a marketing agency. You're basically hiring someone, a marketing agency, to market you. Autobiography is self-marketing. Memoirs, most of the memoirs that I have read, especially for the Union and Progress memoirs, is an attempt to cover up a deficiency. Actually, they are, covering up their crime in those memoirs. Then comes the diary. Diaries are real, and that's what I'm talking about. The diaries are a unique way to document identity and a perfect prime resource for a historian to write history or rewrite the history. Diaries are written spontaneously, driven by personal motivation, and are unlikely to be intended for publication anytime soon. Diaries differ from other type of the ego documents, like, again, it's an autobiographic, like autobiographic materials or memoirs, because in the memoirs, the author have a specific reason for writing. Usually it's a defense. While memoirs are written many years later and often serve a purpose such as commercial success, defense of a crime, or hope to be remembered in the future, and etc. But the diaries are usually a more genuine view of a person's identity. Diaries focus on capturing immediate experiences without extensive interpretation. The diaries are the texts written for oneself without knowing the outcome. It is like you are talking about the movie, but you know the end of the movie. The memoirs are like, knowing the end of the movie and talking about the movie. But in the diaries, you don't know how the movie will end. So that's why they are more real. In this context, I will share my views on how the diary of Mehmed Cavid Bey, a member of the Central Committee of the Union Progress, and one of the key leaders, and how his diary can contribute to the historiography. And the most interesting thing is that diary was fully hidden. Some portions were hidden for 100 years after being written. So we just have new remnants of those hidden diary recently, actually. He was a key figure in modernizing state finances, a prominent member of the Union and Progress, and an intellectual who left behind significant academic work as well as personal documents. He also kept a detailed diary, a valuable resource for historians. He was a cosmopolitan Ottoman citizen from Thessaloniki, born into a convert Jew family. In Turkish it is called dönme, and he was very skilled in finance. So he lived in a multicultural urban environment in Thessaloniki during Hamidian era. Extensive diary he wrote and offers insight into how a country can experience political, economic, social, and everyday change throughout an individual's lifetime. Cavid Bey began keeping a diary in 1909, shortly after his first wife. Usually we say this is the diary from 1909 till 1924. People immediately think that, oh, 1909 is the year of Hamid leaving the power, etc. No, usually a diary that has to be a significant event for a person's life to start a diary. So people, almost in every diary, how they start a diary, usually there is an individual significant event. In this case, it was the death of his wife. The moment he hears that his wife is dead, he starts writing. And he kept writing till his death, day by day. So his diaries are very detailed. The comprehensive entries, those of the diaries, intend we still do not know why he wrote them, but the way he writes them, he is just basically telling the future generations what has happened. But again, he did not write those diaries to be published soon. His membership of Dönme community, converted Jew family, and also his involvement with the Freemasonry kept him a constant attack from the community as well. After the Turkish Republic's establishment in 1923, he became also one of the main figures opposing Ankara government, and he kept the spirit of CUP until his execution by the Independence Tribunal in 1926. Cavid Bey was a member of the CUP. He was the orator of the party. So basically, he was the spokesperson of the Union and Progress Party. And whenever there has been a finance issue, he was the only one to be consulted. He was probably the only unionist knowing about the money. The rest, probably, there is no second man in the party, knowledgeable about finance. He continued to participate in the government, and after the Union and Progress, even the party rule was ended, he kept his ministerial power for a while. His influence was definitely felt in Ankara, even after the foundation of the Republic. He was executed in 1926 as if like he attempted to murder or assassination attempt of the Mustafa Kemal. And his diaries again I'll show you, but it is since it is covering till 1909 till 1924, it is almost like close to 4,000 pages, day by day. So, Cavid Bey was a politician and who supported liberal academic ideas and authored several books on liberal finance books as well. He embraced diverse multilingual, multi-religious nature of the Ottoman Empire. He made particularly close friendship with the Armenian intellectual community. Many of the faces in this photo may seem familiar to you. From left to right, Kirkor Zohrab, deputy for Istanbul, Varkes Serengilyan, deputy of Hüseyin Cahit Yalçın, he was at that time deputy for Istanbul, as well as Cavid Bey's close friend and a journalist, Cavid Bey himself. And Cavid Bey at that time was the deputy for Thessaloniki. Next to Cavid Bey is Bedros Halatcan, he was the deputy of Istanbul. And next to him, a man named Bimen Der Gazarian, the last person unknown. But the interesting information is that Bimen, when we say that Bimen Der Gazarian, probably nobody will know, in Turkey at least, who that Gazarian. But when we say that Bimen Shen, almost everybody on the street who knows who that person is. He is very famous for composing the song. It is like in Turkish, Yüzüm Şen, Hatıram Şen, Hayalim Şen. It's like my face is happy, jolly, my memories are jolly, happy. So he took the last name Şen. Şen means happy in 1934. He's a very famous composer in Turkey. So Cavid Bey was a Westerner, and he was the only one truly understood the financial matters. He opposed entering the World War I, and because of his opposition, he resigned from the government as a Minister of Finance in 1914, but then he joined back to Finance Ministry in 1917. So, among the memoirs and diaries covering the period from constitutional monarchy through the armistice and the War of Independence, Mehmed Cavid Bey's diaries stand out. Compared to other diaries from that period, especially the war diaries usually starts with like this morning was, it is cold, or there has been some rain, the whole page, nothing. But Mehmed Cavid Bey's diary, pages by pages, talks about what has been happening in the country. So 15 years of span tells us what Union and Progress management or the leaders behaved, acted, and how the country, Ottoman Empire, was dealing with its problems with other countries as well. And during the trial of the Izmir assassination attempt to kill Mustafa Kemal, and he will be subsequently his death sentence, he gives all his diaries to his friend for safekeeping, to his friend Hüseyin Cahit. Hüseyin Cahit Yalçın was the owner of the Tanim and the editor of the Tanim newspaper. Hüseyin Cahit Bey published parts of the diary in 1943 till 1946, 4 years in a row. It was like a daily, division by division publication. 1943 is an interesting year because 1943 was the year when the Talat Pasha's body was brought from Berlin to Istanbul. Actually, even the keeping the Ittihadist or Unionist body movement into Turkey is an interesting step-by-step follow-up the crime as well. First body, when Cemal was shot in Tbilisi, Cemal Pasha's body was brought immediately to Erzurum, and there's a big monument now in the eastern part of Erzurum for Cemal Pasha's funeral. Talat stayed till 1943. Actually, it was Hitler's trying to move, a power move. So actually, they sent Talat Pasha's funeral in 1943. And Enver Pasha's funeral came to Turkey in 1996. And Azmi Bey and Bahattin Shakir's funerals or the bodies were still staying in Berlin. So just following up even the body movement, you can immediately follow how the Turkish leadership or Turkish authorities' brains are working as well. So this, some parts of the diary were published, but interestingly, when you follow the 1943 to 1946, there are certain sections not being published. And then Sahin says, I find it more appropriate not to publish this topic now. I will entrust the memoirs to an institute, then they can do whatever they want. By the way, he says, the thing is that, it says not to publish this topic, it is called Armenian issue. He's just taking that part out of the diary. He says, the only thing I say, he says, Cavid finished this sentence with a word like, Talat will be the target of an Armenian bullet. That's it. In 1943, that's what we see. To be able to see the rest, we had to wait another 50, 60 years. By 2015, 100 years from 1915, Turkish Historical Society decided that they said, okay, they will publish the diaries full. So now we have about 4 volumes, and the views written by Cavid Bey regarding the Armenian genocide and the Unionist leaders and the relationship with the Unionist leaders came to light 100 years later. So it is interesting that, again, it's a huge diary covering of 15 years, 4,000 pages. Some parts will be published probably in the proceedings of this conference, but I'll just take one sentence that Cavid wrote in 1915 September. Again, in his diary, in 1915 September, he writes this. Even its darkest moments, Ottoman history never have witnessed such widespread murder and cruelty. And it goes on and on. It is pages by pages, by the way. I just took it. What I am underlining is, it says, you attempted to destroy not only the political existence, but also the very survival of an entire nation. This is, again, written in 1915. I argue that it is probably one of the strongest, real, valid description of the 1915 with a true and Unionist words. When I say true and Unionist, by the way, we always talk about, Enver Talat Cemal. Who was the 4th? Who was the 5th? Who was the 6th? I argue that Cavid Bey was the 4th, because whenever there is a Unionist conference, he was the man to be pulled. And whenever there is a need for a money situation or the money borrowing from Germany, etc., he was the person to be pulled. And he was so much, everybody was giving credit to Cavid Bey. Even he resigned in 1914, we were thinking that he just stepped aside, but the memoirs showed that till 1917, again getting the actual ministry, he was the hidden Ministry of Finance for the CUP. Because CUP did not assign another Ministry of Finance. Talat Pasha became the duty of Deputy Finance Minister. So basically Cavid Bey was the actual finance minister throughout the war period. So these diaries are very offer detailed insight into the workflows, the meetings, negotiations, the plans, actions, programs, domestic policies, international competition, etc. So these diaries also serve as records of his thoughts and activities. They include very true notes, and he occasionally observes people's implicit reactions through their expressions and gestures. even noting those very important figures like the foreign minister and one of the great powers, etc. Details reveal that the atmosphere of the day. He mentions his work and meetings in his diaries and about himself as well. These the detailed memoirs or diaries were likely created by him for future generations as evidence of his intentions and thoughts. Cavid Bey's diaries are a valuable resource, I said. If one wants to study Ottoman Empire history for the last 10 years or the last 20 years, I think without studying those time, without just looking at these diaries, would be incomplete. So, especially chapter by chapter, you can see how we entered the world. For example, this is interesting also when I said that memoirs are like an attempt to cover up while diaries are not. For example, August the 2nd is an interesting day. Today in Turkey, there are books written about the August 22nd of the 1914. There are dissertations done for that day. That is the day Ottoman Empire decided to go into war. August the 2nd, the secret meeting with the Germany. In that day, August the 2nd, Talat wrote that day, because he was in the meeting, Enver wrote, Cemal was in the meeting, Halil Menteşe was in the meeting, Said Ali Pasha was in the meeting, he was the prime minister, it was Said Ali Pasha's house, and Cavid Bey was there as well. All 5 memoirs and 1 diary were written about the August the 2nd, how the Ottoman Empire entered the war. So it is interesting to see and evaluate those days through memoirs as well as the diaries. And you can see discrepancies and the rest. Again, these are all good. Is it? No. The same person, Cavid Bey, writing those words, saying that this is the ultimate crime, was summoned in 1918 to a 5th Commission Parliament interview. You know, after 1918, all the Ittihadis, all the 6 Ittihadis were left the country. He stayed. He was asked in a 5th Commission, Parliament Commission interrogation about the days of 1915. His answer, even though we know that what he wrote in 1915, but his public answer was, I don't know anything. He kept silence. And he never uttered a single word to discriminate Talat or Enver or Cemal. So it shows us that, you know, actually, yes, Cavid Bey looks like a good person, liberal person, but he was an Ittihadist till he died. One of my friends calls him a civilian Ittihadist. The rest are the military. So with that, for example, also, you know, you see Mustafa Kemal there, how he betrays or conveys Enver Pasha is interesting. I'll just one thing about how he talks about Enver, for example.
2 minutes.
Okay. He says, now he's talking about one single day in 1960, the end of 1950. We talked about the war with Enver. He had the strangest opinion, and even if we didn't win anything or get compensation, the war was still profitable for us. Enver thinks the war was still profitable for us. At least we built roads. He said, Enver said that this, you know, yes, so many people died, but at least we built roads. So it shows Enver's mentality as well through a diary. And then Cavid Bey writes, if building these roads, each kilometer of which costs the blood of several hundred thousands of people. So, for example, for him, Enver is always like a brainless, short-sighted idiot, for example. But you see in Cavid Bey, when he publishes them in 1943, 1946, deletes those words. So we do not see those demeaning words about the Ittihadis. Same thing about Mustafa Kemal, because he writes so negative things about Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, but Hüseyin Cahit took them out. We only see them today. So with that, I will leave it to you as being the last participant. It was difficult.